Hallo, hallo. God kveld alle sammen. Nå klokka 7:30, og nå starter vi på et nytt arrangement i K-Economics. Dette dag 2 av 4. Og i kveld skal vi ha en god 20 minutters gratis samtale om noe veldig viktig som påvirker alle. Vi har kalt det reklame og hjernevask. Så jeg håper at alle klar for det. Og dessverre så må dere klare dere uten musikk nå i 20 minutter. Men det 2 veldig interessante deltakere vi har her. Det Joel Bakan, professor i juss, og det Terje Eide i markedsføringshuset. Så uten videre utsettelse så ber jeg dere ønske de velkommen.
Thank you, Thomas. I guess most of you guys are Norwegian, but since Joel is not fluently in Norwegian, I'll have to do this in English.
I'm not even close to fluent.
Yeah. As Thomas said, my name is Terje. I work in a company called Markedsføringshuset. I used to work in an advertising agency 20 years ago. I don't remember if we did much communication through kids, but it's a very interesting topic. I have 3 kids myself, and I see how they interact with communication all the times, and I am constantly asked if I can buy stuff to them. We could all read in the invitation that advertising brainwashes us. The younger we are, the more influenced we are. And it also said, is this just a conspiracy theory? Are the big companies really trying to brainwash our children into to buy stuff we don't need? You have done some serious thinking about this. You have written a book. We're going to come into that one. Litt tettere mikrofon. Det bra. Takk. Så bra. A short introduction. You have an exciting background. You are a professor of law at the University of British Columbia. You have degrees from Oxford, Harvard, and is it called Dalhousie? Dalhousie, okay, yeah. You have written a rather famous book and a film, The Corporation, and the film is going to be shown afterwards in Oljemuseet, 9:30, and I hope most of you guys are going to see the movie. And most relevant for this discussion, you have written the book called Childhood Under Siege, How Big Business Targets Children. So that's the background, your very exciting background. The first question I have for you, Joel, is what has been your motivation to engage in this topic? A couple of words about that.
Yeah, so maybe I can move into that question from an earlier question. The name of this session is Brainwashing and Commercials. And I think brainwashing isn't quite the right term. What marketers try to do with children is to form their brains. They're interested in children because there isn't a lot to be washed in children's brains. They're still tabula rasas to some extent. They're impressionable. They haven't had a lot of experience in the world. And so for marketers, this is a fantastic thing, because if you're a marketer, there's a particular kind of person that you want and that you want to create. You want a person who sees their self-worth through what they own, through what they have, not what they are. You want a person who desperately needs to get things in order to feel valuable, in order to feel cool, in order to feel beautiful, in order to feel that they don't smell. I mean, how many advertisements presume people are really fearful about how they smell, deodorants and this and that and the other thing. So they all appeal to these emotions of insecurity. They also appeal to things like sex and our fascination with that and our draw to that, and violence. And they also want somebody who is compulsive, who doesn't think very much about things, but just does, and who's addictive. Because there's nothing, I mean, people always talk in business about the need for repeat customers. Well, there's nothing better for getting a repeat customer than a person being an addict. I mean, drug dealers know this. And so the ideal person for the marketer is addicted, compulsive, drawn to sex and violence, not thinking very much about things, and defining themselves, their meaning, their purpose in life, their ideals in terms of things. And so what marketers try to do, going back to the point about, is it a conspiracy? Of course it's not a conspiracy. It's just good business. If you're a marketer, you want to sell things. If you want to sell things, you want people who are prone to your message that they should buy them. And therefore you want that person I just described. And so what marketers try to do when they aim their sights at children, when they target children, is they try to create those people, to form them, which is why I say it's not brainwashing, it's more about forming. And increasingly, they've been able to do that because, and we can talk about this more as we go, but because of the intervention of technologies that enable marketers to get closer to kids. Now, why did I get into this? I have a 12-year-old son. And I had a 12-year-old son. He's now 20-something. But when I decided to write the book, he was 12 and my daughter was 13. And I was watching them go through this process of being formed by marketers, while I was screaming from the sidelines, but with no influence at all. Because a Chiquitas or Doritos ad had a lot more influence than I would if I was trying to talk about healthy eating or eat your broccoli or whatever. So I was seeing that at a very personal level. And then one day, I saw my son Mayim, he and his friends were all crowded around the computer. And, you know, in the old days, they'd all watch TV together. Now they were on the computer. And I thought, well, and they were really, really intense and fascinated and all of that. And I talked to him after. I said, well, what were you doing? He said, Dad, it's the coolest site in the world. It's called addictinggames.com. And I thought, wow, they call it that? And so, but that wasn't the worst of it. I went to addictinggames.com and I went to the most popular games section because I figured that's what my son and his friends would be playing. And addictinggames.com was not owned by some, shady operator. It was owned by Nickelodeon, right, which is like Disney, a major award-winning children's entertainment provider. So I went to the most popular games, and among the most popular games, the most popular were two. One that was called Whack Your Soulmate, and the other was called Boneless Girl. And so Whack Your Soulmate was basically not a super complicated premise. It's think of somebody who's your friend or your mother or father or sister or brother, and now pummel them to the point where they die in very, very graphic terms, animated terms. And so that's what the game was. It was basically manipulating with the mouse the whacker who was whacking the other person until they died. And there would be blood and limbs flying all over the place and things like that. Then the other one, Boneless Girl, was, I think the teaser was something like, pull this babe through Bubble Land, the amount of times you can hit her and do these other things to her is immense, or something like that. I don't encourage you to go and find these games, which I'll talk about in a moment, but Boneless Girl basically had you manipulate with the mouse a semi-naked girl through all of these things that would smash her body and contort her and things like that. So this is what Nickelodeon, which is owned by Viacom, which also owns CBC. All of these are, blue chip corporations. They're not, as I say, shady operators. Nickelodeon, owned by Viacom. This is how they are monetizing children. This is how they're making money. They're putting this stuff up there. And believe me, if you're an 11-year-old or a 12-year-old or whatever, you're going to be pulled to this. It's edgy. That's what you want. You want edge, and you're going to be pulled to it, and you are pulled to it. And that's what they're showing. Now, I was so appalled I wrote the book. I also wrote a New York Times editorial about these games. And after that editorial, they were pulled down. So now I can't say to you, go and look at these games, because I don't know how I feel about that. I feel good that the editorial had that effect. You can still find the games on the web. You just can't find them at addictinggames.com anymore, owned by Viacom. They're at other operators. So I decided to write the book that day. When I saw those games, I said, something really bad is happening in our society.
Yeah. Looking at your work, it's rather obvious that you're not a big fan of big companies or the way they behave, especially towards children. Some companies are talking about corporate social responsibility, CSR, trying kind of to use some money on CSR topics. You're not a big fan of CSR, are you? Or do you think there's a better way for them to behave the way they should do?
No, I'm not a big fan of CSR because I think it's deceiving. In my first book, The Corporation, I asked the question, if the corporation were a person, because legally, at least in North America, and this is true in European corporate law as well, corporations are treated as artificial persons. They're given personhood in order to have rights and liabilities at law. And I'm a law professor. That's what I do. And I always thought that was bizarre. So I said, well, if it is a person, what kind of person is it? And the premise of the first book and the film that it'll be showing, I think at 8:30, not 9:30, but I could be wrong about that.
That's 8:30, sorry.
8:30.
Yeah.
The premise is that when you actually diagnose the corporation as a person, it's a psychopath. Because it's legally programmed always to put its self-interest above everything else, and always to put the pursuit of wealth for its shareholders that constitute it above everything else. And, you know, human beings who are incapable of caring about other people, who only care about themselves, we usually diagnose as psychopaths. And so the whole idea of corporate social responsibility, it's like asking a psychopath to be socially responsible. And I'm now making a new film. I'm in the middle of shooting it. And since the first, this idea of corporate social responsibility has become much bigger. Now companies are saying they're sustainable, that it's at the core of their businesses, and we should cheer them on because they've truly transcended this badness that they used to have. And so the conceit of the second project is still a psychopath, but a more charming one. And as a consequence, a more dangerous one. And there isn't really time here to go through all these examples. What I would suggest is you buy my book, of course, and you can go see the film, but it's also, the film is online. It's all over the place. And early 2019, watch for the sequel, The Corporation 2, the unfortunately necessary sequel.
I thought that your book was only available in English, but you told me just to go that it's also available in Norwegian.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I can't remember the name of the Norwegian publisher. It's in Oslo, but the book was translated into, I think, 26 languages, so you can take your pick.
Before I'll ask you to kind of give away some of the highlights from the book, there's one question that I'm particularly interested in. I have been to more than 100 seminars about digital marketing, and a lot of the experts are talking about kids today as digital natives, in the sense that they understand naturally what's going on around them. They know how to maneuver around, and they understand what's happening. In regard to your interest in advertising and kids, how do you reflect on the term digital natives?
So earlier I mentioned that I thought one of the aspects of the title of this session was inaccurate because it talked about commercials. And the reason why that's inaccurate is because it assumes a world which still somewhat exists, but it's being largely transcended. It assumes a world where you have content, you have culture, you have arts that is unpolluted by commercialism, that's unaffected by it. So you have a beautiful TV show like Occupied, which I loved. I don't know if any of you, it was made here, it's a Norwegian If you haven't seen it, you should watch it. It's a Norwegian TV show, Occupied. But anyway, so you have a great TV show, and then you interrupt it with commercials. That model is gone. And what's happening online is endemic of that. The whole distinction between content and commercialism is gone when kids online are not only creating their own content. In other words, content isn't culture anymore. You don't go out and make a TV show. It's our lives that are the content on Facebook. It's our social relationships. It's our dramas. It's our, cat singing or whatever, these videos that people watch. This is the content now. It's no longer made. And that content is infused with commercialism rather than having commercial breaks. So you're liking brands. Brands are liking you. If you're kids, there's this whole peer-to-peer marketing that's going on the web. So certain kids are brand ambassadors, and they're basically touting whatever product or service to their friends on Facebook and putting out contests. And so this whole notion that we had a world that could be separated into content and commercials is really over. And it's over in part because of what's happening online. And when you add to that the data mining that goes on, the way that the companies keep track of what kids want, what they like, who they're talking to, and create what are called social graphs of each kid that then enables them to tailor their advertising to that kid specifically. And you're talking about fairly, kids are not, as you point out, they're not that experienced in the world. This stuff is hard enough for us. Adults, I find it really hard to wonder, what are they tracking me on? What do they know about me? All this. But they're doing this to kids who really have no idea what's going on and what are the consequences.
You wrote the book in 2011, is that right? 6 or 7 years ago. Maybe you could kind of give away some of the highlights from the book and reflect a little bit around whether we are on a better place today or are things getting worse.
Yeah, so the book, this issue of marketing to children is just one issue that I deal with in the book. Some of the other issues I deal with are the reemergence of child labor in the developed world, in the United States and Canada and Great Britain. I deal with the corporatization of schools. It's not an issue in Norway, but it is a huge issue in the United States. And more concern even for me is it's an issue in the developing world, where a lot of African countries like Kenya, Liberia, Nigeria, Uganda are now making deals with American for-profit education companies to come and provide schools. And the schools are usually substandard, highly standardized, poor teachers, underqualified teachers. And it's all done on a for-profit basis. So I talk about that issue. I also talk about the unique vulnerabilities of children to environmental harms. So I basically look at all these different places where kids are being vulnerable. They're either being targeted for exploitation or they're being neglected in the thinking of different kinds of industries. As to whether things are getting better, I don't think so, which is why I decided to make another film and write another book, and why I entitled it The Unfortunately Necessary Sequel. I think the trends that I identify in my earlier work of corporations acting with impunity to cause harm to the environment, to kids, to social types of values and issues, I think that's getting worse, and I think government's abilities and willingness to stop them from doing it is weaker, is weakening. What happened in the United States election is obviously a major example of that, and obviously if you go country by country, you're going to see differences. But in terms of the specific issue we're talking about, if you go back to 1951, the only advertising that a kid would see when that child wasn't with his or her parents was maybe in the back of a comic book. You then add television, you then add cable television, you then add computers, you then add tablets, you add smartphones, you add gaming consoles, and you add more and more sophisticated and psychologically sophisticated techniques on the part of marketers and advertisers. And you've gone from a problem that was, not a problem, to one in which children are existing, and the term marketers like to use is 360 degrees, 24/7 in a commercial environment. They're going to sleep with their smartphones. And each of those kinds of tablets and smartphones, that is a conduit for marketers to get to kids. And believe me, they use it. So it's not a conspiracy, again. And one of the really central points I make in all my work is it's not a conspiracy. It's the logic of a particular political and legal regime, namely that you create these things called corporations. You imbue them with a character that says their only job is to create wealth and nothing else matters. If that's what they're doing, they're going to do the kinds of things they're doing. It's not people sitting in a dark room smoking cigars. It's right out there in the open. It's what we have created in corporate capitalism.
There's time for one or two questions from the audience. If anyone is interested to ask Joel a question. Anyone that would like to ask him?
In the corner?
Yes, in the corner.
Yeah. Are there any good big corporations?
It's a really good question. Are there good corporations? And I have a twofold answer to it. Some corporations are better than other corporations. There's no question. Some corporations try harder to build social responsibilities and to build sustainability. And Unilever is an obvious example. It's a company that makes a lot out of sustainability. So that's one part of the question. But the second part of the question is, I'm less interested in the differences among corporations than I am in the common structure that they all share, which I believe is problematic, and which makes it very difficult for them to embrace social and environmental values in fundamental or substantial ways. It's not that the people who work in corporations don't want to, and I'm always very clear in my work that there are as many good people in corporations as there are in unions or in churches, or in government. But when you're in an institution, you either work in accordance with the institution structure or you quit. And an example I like to use, and it's not a bad one. I mean, Norway, your ice hockey players are okay. They're not great. I mean, you do okay sometimes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But I come from Canada, right, where like ice hockey is everything. And I played ice hockey. And when I was on the ice, I was a very nasty player because I had very little talent. And so what I would do is I would hook people and slash people, and I would do all that. And I would know that the worst that could happen to me is I'd end up in the penalty box for 2 minutes. But I know that if I did what I did to friends or colleagues at work, I'd end up in jail for several years in prison, right? And so I see the corporation like an ice rink in hockey. It's a place where the moral world is different, where the moral structure is different, where to be good, to be successful, you have to manifest the basically self-interested, selfish ethos that's built into the corporation through law. And so it's that commonality that I'm interested in. It may be that this corporation is more imaginative in working with that structure, and this one is less, or this one's got a CEO who's more interested in that. So there are differences. But it's the structure that I find problematic. And where it leads is we need to be aware of that. And if we're going to try to achieve social and environmental good, we need to rely on public authorities whose mandate is to achieve social and environmental good in a democratic way. I don't need to tell you that because Norway is probably one of the better countries in the world in doing that. The United States is probably one of the worst, and Canada, where I come from, is somewhere in the middle. But to me, that's where the solution lies.
I think there's one more question before we close.
Yeah, I guess you already touched it in the end there. I was wondering about, so what do we do? Do we have powers as consumers? Do we need to push the legislation? Do we need to apply pressure to our politicians? We just had an election here in Norway, and in that election, data, big data, and all of this, it wasn't even mentioned. It was non-case. And I'm wondering, so where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have very limited power as consumers. I mean, consumers act individually, they don't act collectively. This idea that we'll be able to buy our way to a better world, I think is part of the problem, not the solution. I think we do need to do it through public policy. And as frustrating as large P politics can be, I think that's where we have to put our energies. One of the stories I'm looking at in my new movie, I'm looking at cities like Barcelona, for example, where you have very progressive city governments coming into power with activist kinds of agendas. And I'm interested in that as maybe somewhere in between the sort of largeness of dealing with national legislatures, but the smallness of just, if I buy this organic apple, somehow I'm making a difference.
Yes, I think maybe we can take one more before we close, or if not, yes, Morten?
Maybe you can address this in introduction to the film later on, but I was wondering, the corporation came at a specific point in time. So what do you think is the next step?
Well, I've been thinking about that a lot because I'm making a film on the next step. The corporation film came out in 2004. The new film's going to come out in 2019. That's 15 years. And what's happened between that is, the 2008 financial meltdown, the rise of the Occupy movement, all kinds of horrible corporate things like the explosion of the BP platform in the Gulf of Mexico and Rana Plaza collapsing. And so the question is, what now? I mean, and I don't know if your question is what now in terms of the bad side of things or what now in terms of what we can do.
I'm thinking about the legal entity.
Right. So the legal entity I don't see as going anywhere. I think the reason for that is it's essential to large-scale capitalism because the legal entity basically allows for the pooling of large amounts of capital to fund large enterprises like Google and others, that you separate out management from ownership and you tell the owners that they're not liable. It's called limited liability, so they don't have to worry about putting their $10 in that they might lose their house if things go wrong in the company. So it's a longer story, but suffice it to say, large-scale capitalism cannot work without the legal entity of the publicly traded corporation. So I don't see, as long as capitalism's in place, I don't see the corporation going anywhere. Is it possible that we may overthrow capitalism? Then I don't think we would have corporations in the same form. But last I looked at my calendar, I didn't have that written in anywhere, overthrowing capitalism today. But so in the meantime, it's really a question, I think, at all levels of public discourse and public citizenship and public debate, trying to challenge this notion that markets can solve everything, that corporations can solve everything, and trying to regain some balance between this notion of democratic public governance and this capitalist corporate economy.
Yes. I think that's the end of our discussion. You are going to join us down to the movie theater at the Olje Museum. So everyone is invited. It's for free. And after that, you are also attending a discussion at KK, I think, a bit later on.
Yeah.
Halvtid. Yeah. Okay. So you have a busy evening.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah?
Really enjoyed
Yeah.
that. Thank you.
Okay.